When I first saw these 1970 Dodge Power Wagons hanging on the pegs, I knew right away that I had to do a custom with one of these. While the casting itself looks good, the paint color and graphics used, along with the plastic wheels, leave a lot to be desired. So it's time to take this boring looking truck and turn it into something far more eye-catching. To get started, I'll draw out the rivets and take the model apart. The first thing I want to do is get rid of these graphics. If I were to skip this step, the texture from them would show through the new paint. I'll use a fine grit sandpaper to remove them, and then wash the body in water to remove any dust. After this, I allow it to air dry before moving on to the next step, which is applying a coat of primer. I use a gray primer from a rattle can and then set the casting aside. While the primer is drying, I turn my attention to the frame. The plastic wheels on this model have to go, and I'll be replacing them with more realistic ones. To remove the wheels, I wedge a flat-bladed screwdriver in between the plastic tabs holding the wire axles in place. You can always cut these tabs off, or cut the axles as well, but if you're just looking to do a quick wheel swap, this method allows you to put new axles back in without the need for gluing. With the wheels removed, I mask off the front grille and bumper on the frame so I can paint it black. I start with a coat of gray primer and allow it to dry before giving the frame a coat of satin black paint. While it's still wet, I'll remove the masking tape and then set the frame aside for the paint to cure. Now that the primer on the body is dried, I check it over for any imperfections in the casting. This doesn't look to have any issues, so I can now move on to painting. I'll be painting the truck in this banner red paint from a rattle can. Normally when I do these customs, I tend to apply 2 thick coats in order to get a glossy finish on the model. This has to be done carefully, however, as if the paint goes on too thick, runs will occur, or the paint will fill in the fine details, something I like to preserve on these models. So it's the next day and the paint has had time to cure. Looking over the model, you can see the high gloss finish that the paint has. Now I want to do some work to the interior. The black plastic doesn't seem to stand out, and I want the interior to be more noticeable when the truck's put back together. I'll apply a coat of brown paint, but even then I still feel the interior is lacking in detail. To get around this, I decide to paint the steering wheel and shifter handle black, and I feel this looks far better than what it did originally. The last thing I want to do with this piece is to paint the lights on the roll bar. I do this by using the ink from a paint pen and apply it with a toothpick. After looking over the grille on the frame, I feel this is something else that needs more detail. I'll do this by using a black wash, which is just a thinned down acrylic paint. The wash will pull in the low areas and allow the raised details to stand out. Once the black wash is dry, I'll paint in the headlights with the paint pen again and use fluorescent orange paint for the turn signals. With all that done, I can now begin putting the truck back together. To hold everything in place, I apply superglue to the posts on the front and back, and then press the frame back on the body. It requires a bit of muscle to do this, but eventually the model snaps back together. Now I need to look for some suitable wheels for this truck. I root around in my parts bin and find a set of rims and tires which fit the look I'm going for. Since they don't have axles, I'll need to make some new ones. For this, I'm going to be using small nails, which is what I use a lot for axles on my customs. I'll start by cutting the head of the nail off, and I'll have to enlarge the hole in the hub for the new axle to be installed. I use my pin vise and a 1/16 inch drill bit to do this. I'll also need to enlarge the holes in the frame of the truck, but I use a drill bit slightly larger than the axle to allow the wheels to turn more freely. Before installing the new wheels and axles, I need to address this red bit under the truck. This wouldn't look right if I left it as is, so I paint it black to match the frame. Afterwards, I install the new axles and cut them to size. Normally I just superglue the new wheels on the axles, but this time I press them on using a vise. After making sure everything moves freely, I can now put the tires and rims back on the hubs. Upon installing the tires, I noticed that some plastic on the frame limits the amount of clearance with the new wheels. Since these aren't essential to the truck, I use a Dremel and a file to remove the excess plastic and then repaint these areas to hide the modifications. After putting the tires back on, I can now see that the clearance is a lot better and the truck rolls without any issues. Because the truck is lifted, I want to add some steps. I'll be making these out of 20 gauge copper wire. I cut and bend one of the steps by hand and then use the first step as a guide for the second one. To put them on the truck, I'll drill 2 holes in the frame on each side and then use superglue to hold the steps in place. The last thing I want to add to the truck is a rear hitch. To do this, I make one using 1mm styrene. I notice an issue, however, as the back of the truck sits higher than the hitch should be. To fix this, I'll cut some styrene shims and glue them together, which will get things to the correct height. With that done, I glue the hitch to the bottom of the truck. Now sometimes I paint these hitches silver, but most of the time I paint them black to match the frames. I use a toothpick to do this, as in the past I've ruined a lot of paintbrushes due to the superglue not being set. I also go back and use some more silver ink to paint the steps. So before I show the completed model, here's a look at what the truck was like when I started. Now here it is completely rebuilt into a model fit for my 1/64 scale collection. I have to admit that this truck is far better than what it was originally, but then again, what do you expect for something that costs less than $1? Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching.